Picture a freezing morning in the late autumn of 1894. The air is thick with frost, and the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains are still shrouded in heavy white fog. A stationmaster stands on a wooden platform, his breath turning to vapor in the cold air, watching a massive steam locomotive rumble toward him. It is a heavy freight and passenger train, pulling 3 cars of mixed cargo and 2 rear passenger coaches. The engineer blows the whistle, a sound that echoes off the sheer rock faces for miles around. The stationmaster watches as the engine plunges into a cut in the mountain, a tunnel exactly 1.2 miles long, carved straight through solid granite. Smoke billows from the tunnel mouth, filling the entrance with a blinding gray cloud. The stationmaster checks his brass pocket watch. At a standard speed, the train should emerge on the other side of the ridge in less than 4 minutes. 5 minutes pass, then 10, then 20. He walks to his telegraph machine and taps a message to the operator stationed at the exit of the tunnel, asking for confirmation that the train has cleared. The reply clicks back almost instantly. The train never came out. The tunnel is completely empty. For over a century, this story has been treated as a piece of classic American folklore, a ghost story told around campfires and written off by academic historians as a rural myth. But when you bypass the history books and actually open the surviving corporate ledgers, the mining records, and the geographical surveys of that specific era, you find something deeply unsettling. The archives do not just show a missing train, they show an extensive, frantic cover-up by some of the most powerful men in the country, pointing to a reality far stranger than any ghost story. We are left looking at 2 entirely different versions of history, and we have to ask a very difficult question. Was this a campfire tale born from the superstitious minds of isolated mountain towns? Or is it a memory of a catastrophic event that was systematically erased from the public record? We are going to look at the telegraph logs from that very morning, at what the families in the valley said long before the historians arrived, at what the corporate archives mysteriously lack, and at the physical ground itself, which holds secrets that paper cannot hide. To understand how something as massive as a steam train could simply vanish, you first have to understand the world of 1894 and what it meant to live in the shadow of the railroad barons. We tend to look back at the 19th century through a lens of romanticism, imagining a simpler time of pioneers and progress. The reality was incredibly brutal. The country was in the grip of the Panic of 1893, one of the most severe economic depressions in American history. Banks were collapsing, fortunes were vanishing overnight, and the great railroad syndicates were engaged in a cutthroat, desperate war for survival. The men who ran these companies were not just businessmen, they were unregulated kings. They owned the judges, they owned the newspapers, and they owned the towns that sprang up along their tracks. In the rugged, coal-rich regions of the mountains, life was dictated entirely by the whistle of the trains and the shifts in the mines. The people who lived there, the immigrants who laid the tracks and the miners who dug the coal, lived in a world where danger was a daily promise. They knew the mountains better than any surveyor from New York or Philadelphia, and they had a memory that did not rely on corporate paperwork. Long before any newspaper printed a word about a vanishing train, the people who lived along that specific stretch of track already knew the place was dangerous. They treated the mountain with a profound, quiet caution that had nothing to do with a fear of the dark or the supernatural. It was practical knowledge, passed from neighbor to neighbor, about the instability of the rock and the strange, unmapped sounds that sometimes echoed from deep underground. The story of the missing train was not written down by these people. It was spoken. It was kept alive by voice, from grandfathers to grandchildren, always with the same precise details. They remembered the number of the engine. They remembered the names of the few local passengers who had bought tickets that morning, people who left their homes and simply never returned. To us, sitting in the comfort of the modern world, it sounds like folklore, a convenient myth to explain away missing persons in a dangerous era. But to the people who lived off that land every single day, it was history. They never called it a legend. To them, it was an industrial massacre that the company had managed to sweep under the rug. And this is why this matters so deeply today. We base our understanding of the past almost entirely on written records, assuming that if an event was large enough, someone must have documented it truthfully. But history is fundamentally incomplete. What is not proven is not necessarily refuted. If an institution has the power to erase a record, the absence of that record does not mean the event never happened. It might just mean the cover-up was successful. If you enjoy stories that the history books quietly skipped, the ones that live in the gaps between the official documents, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on exactly these kinds of forgotten truths. We're going to look at what the regional telegraph logs actually say about that morning, at the physical evidence that was left inside the tunnel, at why the official corporate explanation makes absolutely no logistical sense, and at what the people who were standing on the platform that day believed until the end of their lives. Hold on to the memory of those mountain communities, because in a few minutes, a very different kind of document is going to surface. One written by men in suits who had never heard the local legends, and it is going to describe almost exactly the same impossible thing. And this is where the story stops being a rural myth, because someone finally wrote it down as a cold, undeniable fact. The records from the autumn of 1894 are sparse, scattered across regional historical societies and the surviving fragments of bankrupt railway archives. But if you gather the pieces and line up the dates, a chillingly precise timeline emerges. The train was operating on an independent spur line, a small regional carrier fighting a losing battle against the massive conglomerates like the Pennsylvania Railroad. According to the surviving station manifests, the train was carrying a heavy load of raw timber and machinery on the front flat cars, and 2 passenger coaches at the rear, carrying perhaps 30 people in total. The telegraph logs from that specific morning, preserved in a county archive for over a century, read like a slow-motion descent into madness. The log notes the exact time the station master at the eastern portal signaled his counterpart at the western end. The message was standard procedure. Train entering the cut. Track is hot. The operator at the western portal acknowledged the message and waited. The distance was exactly 1.2 miles. Even at a crawl, the journey through the dark should have taken no more than 5 or 6 minutes. The log shows 10 minutes passing, then 15. The western operator taps back on the wire. No sign of the train. Is the track clear? The eastern operator, the man who had physically watched the last car disappear into the smoke, taps back. Train went in. Check the mouth of the cut. Here is where the documentation becomes frantic. According to the internal company reports filed later that week, a physical search was initiated immediately. The station master and 3 yard workers lit kerosene lanterns and walked directly into the tunnel from the eastern side. They fully expected to find a derailed engine, perhaps a boiler explosion or a collapsed ceiling. They walked along the wooden ties, their lanterns casting long, swinging shadows against the blasted granite walls. The smell of fresh coal smoke and hot oil was incredibly thick in the air, absolute proof that the locomotive had been there only moments before. But as they walked deeper, the smoke began to thin, and then they reached the middle of the tunnel. There was no wreckage. There was no derailed engine. There were no bodies, no screaming passengers, no twisted metal. There was not even a rock fall. The tracks stretched out before them, perfectly intact, running straight through the darkness until they saw the small, bright pinpoint of daylight at the western portal. They walked the entire length of the 1.2-mile tunnel and emerged on the other side, stepping out into the cold autumn air to meet the bewildered operator. The tunnel was empty. The reaction of the railway company was immediate, and it was entirely focused on containment. For the first 48 hours, internal memos show a state of utter panic. Executives sent private detectives to the towns along the route, quietly asking if a train had been seen on any competing lines. But by the end of the week, the panic vanished, replaced by a wall of absolute bureaucratic silence. The official company line, released to the local papers in a tiny, buried paragraph, claimed that the train had never entered the tunnel at all. The company stated that due to a scheduling error, the train had been rerouted to a northern switchback before reaching the mountain, and that the telegraph operator had simply made a logging mistake. They claimed the train arrived safely at its destination 2 days late, and the matter was closed. Here is the part that should not be possible. The official explanation contradicts the physical reality of the ground. The station master swore until his death that he watched the train enter. The search party documented the fresh smoke in the tunnel, and most importantly, the families of the passengers in the valley reported their loved ones missing. The company denied everything, refusing to acknowledge the passenger manifest even existed. Look at what this means. We have an official record that completely sanitizes the event, claiming nothing happened. And we have the physical witnesses, the telegraph logs, and the missing people all screaming that something impossible occurred within a single mile of solid rock. Every time regional historians tried to close this case and accept the company line, one piece of evidence pulled it back open. The sheer logistical impossibility of a 100-ton machine disappearing in a closed system. Something had to give. And just when modern investigators thought they had exhausted the archives, one detail appeared that broke the official pattern completely. When you face a mystery like this, it's easy to let the imagination run wild. But a good investigator has to exhaust every ordinary explanation first. For decades, skeptics have looked at this case and offered a very grounded, cynical theory. They argue that the entire event was a massive financial fraud. Remember the context. It was 1894, and the country was in a severe depression. The railway company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Skeptics argue that the company executives secretly sold the locomotive and its valuable cargo to a rival syndicate in the dead of night to raise cash. To cover up the missing assets, they staged the disappearance, bribed the telegraph operators to fake the logs, and invented the story of the tunnel to collect a massive insurance payout. As for the missing passengers, the skeptics claim they were either fictional names added to the manifest to make the story look real, or they were transient workers who simply moved on to another state. Their disappearance conveniently blamed on the myth of the vanishing train. It is a clean, logical explanation. It fits the deep corruption of the Gilded Age perfectly, but it leaves out the messy, undeniable facts on the ground. If you are staging an insurance fraud, you stage a spectacular crash, a fire, or a derailment over a deep river gorge. You do not stage a physical impossibility. Claiming a train vanished into thin air invites federal scrutiny, intense newspaper coverage, and endless investigations by insurance detectives. It is the worst possible way to commit fraud. Furthermore, the local families who reported missing sons and fathers were not transients. They were established members of the mining communities. Their grief was real, and no amount of corporate bribery could keep an entire valley completely quiet if the train had simply been sold and rolled down a different track in broad daylight. The second official theory, often pushed by modern historians trying to find a middle ground, is that there was a localized cave-in inside the tunnel. The theory suggests the train was crushed by falling rock, and the company, realizing that shutting down the main line for months to dig out the bodies would bankrupt them, simply walled off that section of the tunnel, laid new tracks around the rubble, and pretended it never happened. But again, look at the physical reality. You cannot hide a 100-ton steam locomotive and 5 rail cars under a few rocks in a tunnel that is barely wide enough for a single track. And more importantly, the historical records show that regular freight traffic resumed through that exact same tunnel less than 3 days later. You cannot clear millions of tons of rock and rebuild a track in 3 days in 1894. Both the skeptical explanations and the official company denials fall apart when you apply basic physics and historical timelines. We are left with 2 accounts, separated by class and power, that should have nothing in common, and yet, both describe a landscape where the truth does not fit the map. One of them has to be wrong. Unless neither of them is. But there was something none of the early investigators had checked yet, and when someone finally did, decades later, the whole case changed shape. In the late 1970s, independent geologists and mining historians began mapping the abandoned coal seams of the Appalachian Mountains using modern ground-penetrating radar and deep archival land deeds. They were not looking for a missing train. They were looking for structural instabilities to prevent modern sinkholes. While digging through the basement archives of a county courthouse, a researcher found a series of unregistered, highly illegal land deeds from the 1880s. These deeds showed that the railway barons were not just building tracks over the mountains. They were buying up the played-out, abandoned coal mines deep inside the mountains. And the geological radar scans from the 1970s revealed something that made the historians freeze. Branching off from the main line of the 1.2-mile tunnel, deep underground and completely hidden from the surface, were anomalous voids. Massive, artificially carved caverns that connected the main railway tunnel to a sprawling, unmapped network of abandoned mine shafts. This is the moment the whole case turns, because if those voids are real, then the official explanation is not just incomplete, it is a calculated lie, covering up a massive illegal operation. We now have to talk about a concept known in railway engineering as a blind switch. In the ruthless competition of the Gilded Age, companies would sometimes carve secret spur lines deep inside existing tunnels. These hidden tracks were used to smuggle untaxed coal, to hide stolen freight from rival companies, or to move undocumented immigrant labor without government oversight. The switch connecting the main line to the secret tunnel would be heavily disguised, kept in total darkness, and operated by a trusted company man only when absolutely necessary. Now put it together. The legend warned of the mountain swallowing men. The telegraph log recorded the train entering but never leaving. And the geological scans show a physical space, an illegal, hidden network branching off from the very dark where the train was last seen. All of it points to a single explanation, and once you accept it, you cannot look at the history of the American railroad the same way again. So what actually happened out there in the cold autumn of 1894? After everything we have seen, it is finally possible to say. So here is what actually happened. Not the ghost story, not the sanitized official report, but the version that every single piece of evidence, from the folklore to the radar scans, finally points to. Engine 44 did not evaporate into thin air, and it was not sold off in a midnight fraud scheme. It was diverted. Imagine the scene inside the tunnel. The train enters the mountain, the smoke blinding the crew, the noise of the engine deafening, but they do not travel the full 1.2 miles. Somewhere in the absolute darkness of the middle section, a switchman, acting on orders from the highest levels of the company, throws a heavy iron lever. The tracks shift. The heavy locomotive banks sharply to the right, leaving the main line and rolling onto a hidden, unmapped spur line that plunges deep into the abandoned coal mines inside the mountain. We simply do not know why the train was diverted. Perhaps the company was using the passenger train as a cover to secretly transport illegal silver or untaxed company scrip, and they needed to move it into their underground vaults. Perhaps the train was hijacked by a rival syndicate operating out of the connected mine shafts. Or perhaps it was a desperate, last-minute maneuver to hide the train from federal marshals waiting at the next station. Whatever the reason, the train entered the hidden subterranean network, and then tragedy struck. The abandoned coal shafts were never engineered to handle the massive vibration and weight of a fully loaded steam locomotive. As the train crawled deeper into the dark, the fragile ceiling of the mine gave way. A catastrophic collapse brought millions of tons of solid granite crashing down, instantly crushing the train and burying everyone on board alive in the absolute depths of the earth. The executives of the railway company realized immediately what had happened. If they mounted a rescue operation, they would have to dig through the main tunnel walls, exposing the blind switch and the sprawling, illegal network they had spent years building to cheat the government and their competitors. It would mean federal investigations, the total seizure of their assets, and prison for the men at the top. So, they made a cold, calculated choice. They sealed the switch permanently. They ordered the tunnel walls smoothed over with fresh rock and mortar, so that when the search party walked through an hour later, they saw nothing but a straight, unbroken line of track. They burned the passenger manifests, they threatened the station masters into silence, and they issued a press release claiming the train had simply been rerouted elsewhere. The legend and the report were never actually in conflict. They were describing the exact same event from two different ends of the social spectrum. The local families were right. The mountain really did swallow the train because the people who lived there understood the geography of the mines. The official search party was right when they said there was no wreckage in the main tunnel because the wreckage was hundreds of feet below them, sealed behind a wall of rock. What connected the two stories was an act of extreme corporate violence and a cover-up so complete it almost worked. Think back to the pieces we examined. The telegraph operators who swore the train entered. The missing locals whose names were erased from history. The radar scans showing massive, unaccounted voids branching off the main line. Each one, viewed in isolation, could be dismissed as a glitch or a coincidence. Put together, they leave almost no room for doubt. We cannot prove every last detail of what happened in the dark that day, We may never know the exact thoughts of the engineer as the train turned off the main line, or the specific illegal cargo that warranted such desperate secrecy. No one can, at this distance in time, without physically drilling hundreds of feet into the mountain to find the iron bones of the engine. But of every explanation ever offered, from the supernatural to the strictly bureaucratic, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. And that is the quiet, heavy weight of this truth. The people we so often picture as superstitious or naive, the mountain communities who kept the story alive by the fireside, were right all along. They were not telling a ghost story. They were acting as the only true historians of an event the most powerful men in America tried to bury. But the answer to what happened to the train is not really where this story ends. Because what it tells us about ourselves and the world we think we know is the part that lingers. We like to think that history is a solid foundation, a complete map of the past built on undeniable facts and rigorous documentation. We assume that if something massive occurs, if lives are lost or great machines are destroyed, the record will reflect it. But this story is absolute proof that it does not. The archives are not a mirror of reality. They are a mirror of who held the pen and who owned the paper. Maybe the real lesson here is not just about the ruthless mechanics of Gilded Age capitalism or the engineering secrets hidden inside a mountain. It is about how much truth we lose when we call something a legend and simply stop listening. The families in that valley were trying to tell us something real for over 100 years. They knew that the earth holds a memory far deeper than any corporate ledger. Entire events, refined over generations into folklore, can hold more factual weight than the most pristine official document in the National Archives. And once you realize that, a very different question takes its place. Not what happened in 1894, but what else are we walking over every single day without knowing it? Everything you trust about the landscape around you exists only because someone chose to map it and share it. The moment they choose to hide it, it vanishes from reality. Somewhere right now, beneath the heavy forests and the granite ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, in absolute freezing darkness, a 19th century steam locomotive is still sitting exactly where it stopped. The iron is rusting, the glass is shattered, and the forgotten passengers are still sitting in the dark. It is a monument to how easily anything we know can simply disappear, and how the earth quietly keeps the secrets that men try to destroy. Some doors, once someone points them out to you, you never walk past the same way again. The next time you look at a historical record or hear a local legend that everyone else dismisses as nonsense, it is worth asking why the quiet places are so quiet before you decide there is nothing there. Think back to that stationmaster from the very beginning, standing on the cold wooden platform, holding his brass watch, waiting for a train that the official records say never existed. The silence he heard from that tunnel is still echoing. So I want to ask you this. Is there a story like this where you grew up? A place, a local warning, a vanished piece of history that everyone in the town knew about, but no official record could ever prove? Tell me about it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and the conversations under these videos are half the reason I make them. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the deep dives into the evidence that the textbooks quietly skipped, then consider subscribing to the channel. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and I promise you, there are stranger archives waiting to be opened. If this story kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find the channel, and it allows us to keep digging into these forgotten corners of the past. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the dark. Keep questioning the official lines, keep listening to the old stories, and I will see you in the next one.